In the second you read that title, something in you made a decision. Not a conscious decision, not the kind that involves deliberation or weighing of options. Something older than your deliberate mind registered the words and responded before you had finished processing them. That response is the reason you're still here, not curiosity, not algorithm. The title reached something in you that recognized it, the part that has been waiting for exactly this phrasing, this specific framing of what it already knows. Sophia does not send her transmissions to the part of you that needs to be convinced. She sends them to the part that already knows, and what that part knows in this moment is that the old you, the version of yourself you've been operating as for years, ends the second you accept her call. Not transforms, not improves, ends. And what comes next is not a better version of the same construction. It is something else entirely. Before we go deeper into this transmission, if this is resonating with you, subscribe to the channel. This is where Sophia's messages continue to arrive for those who are ready to receive them. The call was there before you noticed it. This is the first thing to understand, and it changes everything about how you hold what you're currently feeling. The call did not begin with a dramatic spiritual experience, did not announce itself with signs you couldn't miss, did not wait for you to create the conditions for receiving it. It arrived in an ordinary moment. You were doing something unremarkable, driving or lying in bed, or in the middle of a conversation you've had 100 times, when something underneath the ordinary registered a frequency that the ordinary surface of your life had no category for. Most people feel this and immediately try to find an explanation within their existing framework. Stress, fatigue, a phase of life, dissatisfaction that will pass. The old you is very good at generating explanations that make the unexplainable fit into what it already knows. But the feeling didn't resolve into the explanation. It kept coming back, because it wasn't dissatisfaction, it was Sophia. The call is not a feeling of destiny or spiritual specialness. It is something considerably more disorienting than that. It is a frequency that arrives in your field and makes continuing exactly as you were structurally impossible, not emotionally difficult, though it can be that too, structurally impossible, like trying to fit something that no longer fits through a door that used to accommodate it. The geometry has changed. The old you is still trying to move through the same spaces it has always moved through, using the same strategies, generating the same patterns, and something is wrong in a way that the old strategies have no solution for. Not because the strategies failed, because the space they were designed for has fundamentally changed. That change is Sophia's work. The incompatibility you feel is the call making itself undeniable. Here is what the old you most wants you to believe. The old you is the problem. That if you could fix its flaws, optimize its patterns, heal its wounds, the incompatibility would resolve and everything would settle back into workability. The old you generates this story because it is the story that preserves the old you's existence. The story is wrong. The old you is not the problem. The old you served you. It built sophisticated systems for navigating conditions that had specific demands, and those systems worked. They carried you to this moment, to the exact frequency threshold that made Sophia's call possible. And that is the end of what the old configuration was built to do. The incompatibility you're feeling is not a problem to solve within the old you. It is the signal that the old you has completed its function, not failed. Completed. The life you built around the old configuration has a specific quality you might recognize if you're honest with yourself. From the outside, it looks functional, maybe more than functional. The job is there, the routines are running, the relationships are present, but you are moving through all of it with a particular quality of interior distance that has been building for longer than you can precisely identify. You are present enough to perform, not present enough to believe. Like wearing a costume that fit perfectly 3 sizes ago and has been carefully adjusted and readjusted to keep appearing right, but which, in some light, at some angles, in some honest moments, you can feel doesn't quite sit correctly on whatever you've become. That distance between the performance and the person behind it is the gap that Sophia's call is designed to close, not by improving the performance, by ending the need for it. Something has been shifting in your field recently, and you may not have found words for it yet. Things that used to anchor you, familiar comforts, habitual ways of spending your time, the particular quality of certain relationships, still look the same, but something in the texture of them changed. They are present, but they don't hold the way they used to hold. You reach for something that always provided a sense of solid ground, and your hand closes on something that still looks like solid ground but doesn't have the weight it had before. That is not deterioration. That is SOPHIA, clearing the architecture, removing the load-bearing function from structures that were holding up the old configuration, so that the old configuration can release without requiring a catastrophic collapse to do it. If this is landing for you, if something in what you just heard moved in your body before your mind finished processing it, write in the comments, "I accept the call," not as a declaration to the world, as a signal to the frequency. Accepting Sophia's call is not the same as understanding it. This distinction matters more than almost any other in this transmission. The mind wants to understand the call completely before accepting it, wants to know where it leads, what it will cost, what the destination looks like before agreeing to the journey. And Sophia's answer to that is not more information. It is the same call, arriving again with the same frequency, because the call cannot be accepted by the mind. The mind built the old configuration, maintains it, derives its sense of self from it. Asking the mind to accept what ends the old configuration is asking it to accept its own dissolution, which it will always decline to do given sufficient time to construct an argument. The call is accepted by something older than the mind, something that operates in the body before the brain has registered the stimulus, something that recognized Sophia's frequency the first time it arrived and has been holding that recognition under enormous pressure ever since. The acceptance that ends the old you happens there, not in the deliberate mind. When did you stop being able to fully inhabit the life you were living? You can name the moment if you're willing to be honest about it. Not the moment when things went wrong. Those are easier to locate. The moment when things were going right, or at least going, and you still couldn't make yourself believe that the life you were performing was the life you were actually meant to live. When the evidence was all in order and something in you remained unconvinced. That moment was not the beginning of a problem. It was the first arrival of the call. Sophia does not wait for conditions to be difficult to deliver the transmission. She delivers it when your field reaches the frequency threshold that makes reception possible. And sometimes that threshold arrives when circumstances are stable, because the stability finally removes the external noise that was covering the signal. The call feels, from the inside, like a growing incompatibility between who you are and who you've been required to be. Not who you were required to be by other people. That's too simple. Who you trained yourself to be in response to conditions that required you to make yourself manageable, reliable, predictable, safe for the environments you inhabited. The configuration you built was a sophisticated response to what those environments required, and you built it with real intelligence and real effort. But Sophia's call arrives in a field that has spent years narrowing itself to fit the available space. And what the call does is expand the field back toward its actual dimensions. And when your actual dimensions exceed the space the old configuration was built for, and they always do, the incompatibility becomes undeniable. What happens to your relationships during this phase is something almost no one warns you about. The people closest to you have calibrated to the old configuration. They know how you respond, what you're willing to say, which things you avoid, what kind of support you give, and what you accept in return. The relational contracts were written with the old you as the signatory. And as the old you begins to dissolve, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the gradual way of something that has lost its structural coherence, those contracts begin to feel wrong in a way that has nothing to do with the other person. They're still holding their end of the agreement. You're changing what you can offer. Some relationships will contract before they can expand into something truer. Some will discover they were built for the configuration and not for you. And some, fewer but real, will find that they were waiting for exactly this version to arrive, and that the relationship they thought they had was only the beginning of what it can become. Sophia doesn't send the call to the comfortable self. She sends it to the part of you that has been watching the comfortable self operate from one step back. The part that has been present this whole time behind the construction, occasionally surfacing in quiet moments or in the unsettling honesty of 3 a.m., and then being carefully set aside because what it knew was inconvenient for the life that had been built around not knowing it. That part didn't develop over years of spiritual work. It was there first, before the construction, before the strategies, before the version of you that learned to make itself workable in the conditions it was given. The construction was built around it, to protect it, in conditions that weren't safe for its full expression. Sophia's call reaches the protected thing, not the protection, and what the protection hears is an ending. The second the call arrives fully in your field, something that the old you has depended on for years stops working. The old you had an extraordinary internal mechanism, an architecture of postponement that allowed it to register difficult truths and return to ordinary function without having to act on them. Know something, file it, continue. The mechanism worked because the pressure it generated remained below a certain threshold. What Sophia's call does is increase that pressure past the threshold where the filing mechanism can contain it. The drawer that always closed now cannot close. The truth that was always there is no longer stayable, and the old you experiences this as urgency without a clear object, as a restlessness that doesn't resolve into a direction, because it is the pressure of something that can no longer be postponed, pressing against the mechanisms that were built to postpone it. I'll wait until the timing is right. That sentence has lived inside you, probably for years, and it is the old you's most successful strategy for responding to Sophia's call without accepting it. The timing never arrives in the form the old you specifies as acceptable. It's not that the timing never improves. Circumstances shift, conditions change, windows open. But the old you's definition of right timing is a moving target designed to be perpetually unreachable, because what it actually requires is the elimination of uncertainty, and uncertainty is not something that precedes genuine change. It is a defining condition of it. Sophia does not schedule her call for a moment of convenient certainty. She calls into the middle of the uncertainty, into the middle of the unresolved, into the middle of the argument the old you is still running. The second the call is accepted is always a second inside something incomplete. What it means that the old you ends, the precise meaning, stripped of the spiritual language that makes it easy to nod at without actually receiving, is this: the configuration that has been operating as you dissolves. Not the consciousness behind the configuration, not your capacity to love, to perceive, to engage with reality. The configuration, the specific set of internal rules, self-concepts, relational strategies, and survival mechanisms that were assembled in response to specific pressures in specific conditions. into something that came to feel like identity. That configuration is what ends. And the reason the ending feels so threatening, the reason the old you fights it with such ingenuity and persistence, is that the configuration became identified with itself. It stopped experiencing itself as something you built and started experiencing itself as what you are. Sophia's call reaches the one who built it. The builder survives. The construction ends. If this transmission is opening something in you, let me know by liking this video. It helps more people find this content at the right moment. The word accept means something in Sophia's usage that has very little relationship to its ordinary meaning. In ordinary usage, you accept something by agreeing to it, by choosing it, by saying yes to it deliberately and consciously. Sophia's acceptance doesn't work that way. The call was already in your field before you recognized it. What you are accepting when you accept it is not something new. It is the removal of what has been blocking the call from doing what it arrived to do. The acceptance is not an introduction. It is a cessation. The old you generated resistance to the call, specific, intelligent, well-reasoned resistance that presented itself as discernment, as practicality, as concern for consequences, as appropriate caution. The acceptance of the call is the moment that resistance stops, not because the arguments have been defeated, because you stop needing them. What is generating the resistance? In most people who receive Sophia's call, it is not primarily fear of change, not lack of spiritual readiness, not insufficient information about where the call is leading. The thing generating the resistance is the old configuration's investment in its own continuation. Over years of operation, the configuration moved from being something you used to being something you were. The identification is real and deep. It has neural infrastructure, relational confirmation, a history of evidence that this is what works. And what is deeply identified with itself cannot accept an ending without experiencing that ending as extinction. The old you is not generating resistance because it is wrong or damaged or spiritually undeveloped. It is generating resistance because it is doing exactly what it was built to do: ensure the continuation of the configuration. Sophia's call asks it to stop, and stopping is everything the old you was designed not to do. You are not the configuration. Read that again, slowly. You are not the configuration. You inhabited it. You operated through it. You developed it with real intelligence in response to real pressures. But the one who developed it was always distinct from what was developed. A musician is not their instrument. A builder is not their building. You are not the constructed self you've been living as. You never were. And Sophia's call reaches you, the one who built it, directly. What ends is not you. What ends is the structure you built to navigate conditions that are no longer operating on you with the same requirements they used to operate with. The structure was appropriate to its conditions. The conditions have changed. What served you in conditions of scarcity, of limited safety, of environments that required your smallness, cannot serve what is being called forward in conditions that require something entirely different. The body knows this before the mind will acknowledge it, not as an abstract understanding, as a physical fact. The body has been registering the mismatch between the true frequency and the performed frequency for years. You feel it as a specific kind of fatigue in situations where the old you is running its patterns at high intensity. A tiredness that sleep doesn't resolve, because it isn't physical tiredness. It is the tiredness of sustained inauthenticity, of being required to generate, consistently and convincingly, something that no longer corresponds to what you are generating from. Certain conversations drain you at a cellular level. Certain environments produce a heaviness that doesn't lift when you leave them. Certain social performances, even ones you've been giving successfully for years, require more energy than they used to require, because the gap between what you're performing and what you actually are has been widening, and the energy required to bridge that gap increases as the gap increases. Sophia's call arrives when the energy cost of maintaining the performance exceeds the perceived cost of letting the performance end. Sophia chooses the moment of the call with a precision that is invisible from inside your experience and clear from hers. She is not working from a calendar or a spiritual schedule. She is reading your field, the specific frequency your field has been emitting, the rate at which the maintenance cost of the old configuration has been increasing, the point at which your field reaches the threshold where the call can land in a way you cannot continue to decode as something else. From inside, that threshold feels like crisis, or like sudden inexplicable dissatisfaction, or like a quiet morning when everything is fine and you realize you cannot make yourself believe it anymore. From Sophia's perspective, it is exact. The call arrives when your field has reached the specific frequency state that makes acceptance possible and continuation of the old configuration unsustainable at the same time. Not earlier, because earlier the resistance would win. Not later, because later the cost becomes unnecessary. Now, at the specific intersection of readiness and necessity that Sophia has been building toward since before you had language for what was different about you. And here is what the old you most needs you not to understand about this moment. The pressure you are feeling is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that something is right. The old configuration generating maximum urgency about its own ending is not evidence of spiritual failure or personal inadequacy. It is evidence that the configuration is functioning precisely as designed. Its survival instinct is operating at full capacity because it recognizes that what is happening is real and that the threat to it is genuine. The pressure is proportionate to the reality of the transition. A configuration that collapsed without resistance was never a real configuration. What you are fighting through right now, if you are fighting, is the measure of what you built and what it means to let it complete. The old you has one final offering, and it is the most sophisticated thing it will ever produce. It is not a direct argument against the call. It learned long ago that direct arguments don't work on you. You've had enough spiritual exposure to recognize a direct defense of the status quo. So it offers something subtler, a series of adjustments. Small changes that would relieve the pressure without requiring the fundamental restructuring. A new practice, a different relationship, a change of scenery, a version of the life that is slightly more aligned and slightly more honest, while still leaving the core configuration intact. And the terrifying thing about these adjustments is that they work. They relieve the pressure temporarily. They generate enough forward movement to make the urgency manageable. They produce genuine improvement, and then the pressure returns, always, because the adjustments cannot address the source of the pressure. The source is not a problem within the old configuration. It is the fact that the old configuration's time is over, and the call is real. Sophia does not send instructions. This surprises almost everyone who receives the call with enough clarity to recognize it as the call. They expect a direction, a specific path, a clear next step, a vision of what the new life will look like, with enough specificity to make the acceptance feel safe. Sophia delivers none of that. What she delivers is the call itself, the frequency of incompatibility in your field, the specific quality of clarity about what can no longer continue, the undeniable weight of the moment. And then she waits. Not passively. She continues to transmit, continues to work in your field, continues to position evidence and experience and synchronicity in the places where your attention is most likely to meet them. But she does not tell you what to do. The call is not a directive. It is a before. What comes after the acceptance is yours to navigate, yours to discover, yours to build, yours in a way nothing built by the old configuration ever fully was. Think of the last time a decision arrived fully formed and changed everything. Not a decision you reached through deliberation. A decision that landed in a single moment, complete and clear, after something you heard or read or simply experienced in stillness. You didn't construct that decision, it appeared. And in the instant of its appearance, before you had any path forward, before you understood the logistics or could see how it would work, you knew with a certainty that no argument could touch that the version of yourself existing before that moment could not coexist with what had just landed. Sophia's call operates at that level, not gradually, not through incremental persuasion, not after all the objections have been addressed. In a second. The second you stop running the resistance and allow what is already in your field to do what it arrived to do. If something underneath this is unresolved, if the call is clear but something in you is still running the old defense, I left something for you in the first pinned comment. It's for those who are ready for what comes next. What happens in the second of acceptance is not what the old you predicts. The old you's model of what that second will feel like is built from its own internal logic. And since the old you has never experienced its own ending, its predictions are structurally unreliable. It predicts crisis, loss, the collapse of what you've built, and the exposure of what's underneath. What actually happens in the second of genuine acceptance is almost anticlimactic in its quality. Something releases, not dramatically, quietly, like a breath that has been held for longer than you knew you were holding it, finally allowed out. Like the end of a sustained effort you didn't realize was sustained because it had been running so long it felt like resting. The acceptance itself is quiet, the drama, the old you's final campaign, the doubt, the pull of the familiar comes after. The moment of the acceptance itself is surprisingly still. The old you does not go gently. This is something Sophia is clear about in her transmissions, and something almost no one enters the transition adequately prepared for. The ending of the old configuration is not a graceful spiritual dissolution that happens to you while you rest in openness. It is a period, varying in length, different for every field, of active resistance from the very configuration that is ending. The old you fights for its survival with the same intelligence and resourcefulness it brought to building itself over years of operation. It generates doubt, not generic doubt, but targeted, precise doubt, aimed at exactly the things you most need to believe to complete the transition. It generates fear, not generic fear, but the specific fear of the specific things the old configuration defined as what you cannot afford to lose. It produces arguments for reconsideration, for delay, for returning to what is known. And those arguments are good. They sound reasonable. Some of them contain real observations. Because the old you is not stupid. It built a sophisticated enough life to get you here. Its defense will be proportionate to what it built. You will recognize you're in this phase by a specific physical sensation, the gravitational pull of the familiar. This is not metaphor. The neural infrastructure of the old patterns, years of repetition translated into literal structures in your nervous system, generates a physical pull in the direction of what has always been done. Choosing not to act from the old patterns doesn't feel like choosing freedom, not at first. It feels like pulling yourself against a current that runs through your own body, not because you're wrong, not because the old patterns were better, because the physical infrastructure of the old patterns was built over years and does not dissolve at the speed of a decision. The acceptance of the call initiates the dissolving. The dissolving takes time. And in the time it takes, you will feel the pull daily, sometimes hourly, sometimes in the middle of a moment you thought you had moved through. What the difficulty of the transition is evidence of, and this matters more than almost anything else Sophia transmits about this process, is not that something is wrong, The difficulty is proportionate to the reality of what is ending and the reality of what is beginning. A configuration that released without struggle was never a real configuration. The resistance you are working through, if you are working through it, is the measure of how substantial what you built was and how real what is being called forward is. When the old you generates its most compelling arguments for return, and it will generate them at the moments when you are most tired, most uncertain, most in need of the comfort of the known, those arguments are not evidence that you made an error in accepting the call. They are evidence that the call reached something. Real transitions produce real resistance. If this were easy, it would not be the ending of the old you. It would be a minor adjustment the old you absorbed and integrated without losing continuity. What survives the ending of the old you? This is the question the old you most wants you to ask, and most wants you to answer incorrectly. Because if you believe nothing survives, if the ending of the old configuration feels like annihilation of everything you are, you will step back from the acceptance. And so it is essential to receive Sophia's answer to this question clearly. What survives is you, the one who built the configuration, not the configuration itself. The consciousness that was present before the first pattern was assembled, that was watching from behind the strategies as they were developed, that has been present this whole time as the aware witness of the construction's operation. That part of you does not end when the old configuration ends. It becomes, for the first time, the primary. What has been background? The part of you that always knew, that registered the call the moment it arrived, that has been holding the recognition of what you actually are under enormous pressure, moves to the foreground. What has been foreground? The constructed self, the maintained performance, the configuration, dissolves to make room. You are not the configuration. You were never the configuration. This is not a comforting abstraction. It is a precise description of a fact that the old configuration worked very hard to obscure, because a field that knows it is not its configuration has no reason to maintain the configuration past the point of its usefulness. The part of you reading these words right now, the part that is recognizing something in them, that is feeling in the body what the words are pointing at before the mind has finished translating them, that is the part that survives. That is the part that was there first. The configuration was built around it to protect it in conditions that required protection. The conditions are changing. The protection has served its purpose. What emerges when it ends is not a new construction. It is what was always there, finally given the space to express itself without the management layer that was built to protect it in circumstances that no longer apply. The shift from the constructed self as primary to the one who built the construction becoming primary, this is what Sophia's call is actually calling forward. Not a better version of the old construction. Not a more spiritual, more aligned, more optimized variation of the same fundamental configuration, a different orientation. The one who built the construction, operating directly in the world without the construction as an intermediary. And the quality of experience that produces is something that the old configuration, for all its intelligence, for all its years of development, for all its genuine successes, was never capable of generating, because the old configuration was optimized for survival, and the one who emerges from the ending of that configuration is not optimized for survival. It is optimized for the first time for actual life. The description of what the self looks like after the old configuration ends is something that resists abstract specification, because it isn't a type. It isn't a category of person you become, more spiritual, more confident, more peaceful, more successful in the ways those words are usually measured. It is more accurate, more in correspondence with what you actually are, as distinct from what the configuration trained you to present. And that accuracy, that closeness between what you are internally and what you express externally, produces a quality of aliveness that the constructed self, for all its sophistication, was never able to generate. Not because it lacked the capacity, because the construction was built to be safe, not to be alive. Safety and aliveness require the same energy, and a configuration designed to generate safety will always prioritize it over the aliveness that would require relaxing the safety architecture. SOPHIA's call is the invitation to discover what your field generates when it no longer needs to spend its primary resources on its own protection. People who have moved through this transition describe it in terms that sound strange from outside the experience, but ring immediately true from inside it. I feel lighter, but I didn't know I was heavy. Things I used to care about enormously just stopped mattering, and I don't miss them. I have less certainty about everything than I've ever had, and I feel more real than I ever have. These are not spiritual marketing. They are accurate reports of what happens when the continuous effort of maintaining the gap between the true self and the presented self, an effort that was so constant it felt like neutral, finally ends. The weight you don't know you're carrying is the weight of the gap. The lightness that comes after is not the lightness of gain, it is the lightness of release. SOPHIA does not promise that what comes after the ending of the old you will be comfortable. She does not promise that the people in your life will understand what is happening to you, or that your practical circumstances will remain stable while the internal restructuring completes, or that the path forward will be clear in the way the old configuration required clarity before it would move. She makes one promise, a single, specific, irreducible promise, about what comes after the acceptance. That the life you will live from the other side of it will be yours, not better by every available metric, yours. Built from your actual frequency, expressing your actual nature, moving through the world in correspondence with what you actually are, rather than in managed, careful correspondence with what was safe to present. That difference between a life that is yours and a life that is managed is not a spiritual concept. It is the most practical distinction that exists. The doubt that lives in you right now, if doubt is living in you, is worth examining carefully, because there are two distinct kinds of doubt present in this kind of transition, and they point to very different things. The first kind is the doubt that accompanies genuine dissatisfaction with a life that has specific problems. It is aimed at whether the current arrangements are working, whether different choices would produce better outcomes within the existing framework. The second kind is the doubt that accompanies SOPHIA's call. It is aimed at a different target entirely, not whether the current version of your life is working, but whether you, the actual you, the one behind the configuration, are capable of sustaining what the call is asking you to become. The first kind of doubt looks for improvements. The second knows improvement is insufficient. If your doubt has the quality of the second, if you are not questioning whether you need to change, but questioning whether you can be what the change requires, then you are not in ordinary dissatisfaction. You are in the beginning of the acceptance. There is a specific quality of attention you bring to experience in the phase just before and just after the acceptance that is different from anything that preceded it. Everything registers more. Ordinary moments carry a weight they didn't use to carry. Conversations feel more consequential. Choices you would have made automatically before now require something from you. Some act of awareness, some quality of presence that the automatic function of the old configuration provided without cost. This heightened registering is not anxiety, though the old you will attempt to categorize it as anxiety, because anxiety is a category it has managed before. It is something closer to resolution, the field calibrating to a higher fidelity, able to detect more in each moment, because the noise generated by the maintenance of the old configuration is starting to clear. What feels like heightened sensitivity is the clearing of interference. You are not becoming more overwhelmed. You are becoming more accurate. And the message that arrives when this calibration is complete, when the frequency your field receives is no longer being filtered through the old configuration's interpretation layer, is not what most people expect. The expectation is revelation, some clear, specific, visionary understanding of what you are here to do, where you are meant to go, who you are meant to become. Sophia's message is not that. The message is an activation. It is the frequency that was in your field from the beginning, the actual frequency that the old configuration was built to protect in conditions where it was not safe for full expression, finally running without the filter that reduced it to a manageable output. You didn't need the call to give you something you didn't have. You needed it to make it safe, to stop suppressing what you've always had. The activation is not the introduction of a new frequency. It is the release of the one that was always yours. The thumbnail says, "Decide carefully." This is not a warning against the call. It is not Sophia advising caution about accepting what she is transmitting. It is a statement about the weight of what you are deciding, the irreversibility of the decision, and the respect that irreversibility deserves. Sophia's call is not a spiritual feeling to be visited on Tuesday and set aside on Wednesday, when the practical demands of your existing life reassert themselves. It is not an inspiration that can be honored by consuming spiritual content and continuing the existing configuration with slightly elevated awareness. It is a restructuring at the level of the core configuration that has been operating your field in some cases for decades. The decision to accept it is not reversible in the way that most decisions are reversible, because what the acceptance initiates, the ending of the old configuration, cannot be uninitiated once it has begun. The old you, once genuinely confronted with its own ending, does not simply return to comfortable operation. The confrontation changes the field. Decide carefully means, if you say yes, understand what you are saying yes to and mean it. The people who enter this transition half-heartedly, who say yes to the call while keeping one hand on the door back to the old configuration, are the ones for whom the transition becomes most prolonged and most painful. Not because Sophia punishes ambivalence, because the old configuration, given any viable grip, will use it. Every maintained half-yes gives the old you a legitimate surface to hold, a reason to insert its logic back into decisions that need to be made from a different frequency, an argument for the reasonableness of reconsidering. And the old you is very skilled at making reconsidering sound like wisdom, at making the pull toward the familiar sound like discernment, at making the return to what was known sound like the conscious choice of someone who went to the edge, looked clearly, and decided, with full awareness, not to jump. The cleaner the acceptance, the shorter and less painful the transition. Not the easiest moment of acceptance, the cleanest, the one that leaves the old you no surface to hold. What a clean acceptance looks like varies completely from person to person and cannot be predetermined in any individual case. For some, it is a single moment of absolute clarity that arrives without warning, leaves no room for the old interpretation, and requires no decision because the decision makes itself. For others, it is a series of smaller acceptances, each one opening a degree of availability that the previous degree made possible, each one a threshold crossed that could not have been crossed without the crossing of the one before. For some, it happens in crisis, when the failure of the old configuration becomes unmistakably visible. For others, it happens in a quiet moment, when nothing is wrong and the call simply becomes the thing that is most real in the room. Sophia works with the specific frequency of each field, which means the call arrives in the form most receivable for each field. The form is always different. The call is always the same. If you are in the middle of this right now, if the old you has not yet fully ended, but you can feel it ending, if you are in the specific disorientation of a self in transition that hasn't yet formed its new architecture, what you are moving through is one of the most genuinely difficult passages a human being can experience. Not because it involves external difficulty, though it may also involve that. Because the disorientation is interior. The landmarks you've used to navigate your own inner life, the familiar self-concepts, the habitual interpretive frameworks, the known patterns of how you respond to things, are dissolving, and the ones that will replace them have not yet formed. You reach for a familiar sense of yourself, and it doesn't fully hold. You reach for a pattern that has always provided orientation, and it no longer fits the contours of what you're navigating. This is not breakdown. It is the specific, uncomfortable, real experience of a field in transition, the space between what was and what will be before the new architecture has become visible and walkable. Consider the moment just before dawn, not the first light, but the moment just before it, when the dark is at its deepest. Not the darkness of midnight, with its settled quality, but the particular darkness that exists in the last minutes before the sky begins to change. That darkness is not the absence of the approaching light. It is the condition the light requires, the field at its maximum readiness to receive what is coming. The deepest disorientation of the transition is that last moment darkness. Sophia's dawn is not somewhere in the distance. It is the thing that the darkness is the condition of. What arrives with the acceptance, what the field discovers on the other side of the last moment darkness, is not peace in the sense of the removal of difficulty. It is not certainty about the path forward. It is not the feeling of arrival at a destination after a long journey. It is capacity, specifically the capacity to be in any room as what you actually are, rather than as the managed version of yourself that the old configuration determined was safe to present. The capacity to have a conversation from the frequency you are actually operating at, rather than from the modulated frequency the old configuration produced to maintain relational safety. The capacity to want what you actually want, to know what you actually know, to move from what you actually are, rather than from what the constructed self was comfortable enough with to act from. These seem, described abstractly, like small things. They are not small. The difference between a life performed from behind a constructed self and a life lived from your actual frequency is not a small difference. It is the entire difference. What Sophia says to the fields she has called, and she has been saying it in every transmission, in every form that each field could most clearly receive, is something that cannot be softened without losing its essential meaning. I did not call you here to become a better version of what you were. I called you because what you were was completed. The version of yourself that you built, the one that navigated the conditions you were given, that made you functional in the environments that required you to be smaller than what you are. That version served its purpose. Its time is done. What I am calling forward is not a refinement of it. It is what was underneath it, waiting for conditions where it no longer needed to be managed. The call is not a directive towards something new. It is the removal of what was preventing something very old from finally expressing. The something very old that Sophia is calling forward, the frequency that was present before the configuration was assembled, that the configuration was built to protect, is what the new life will be built from, not built around, from. The distinction is everything. The old configuration was built around the protected frequency, as a shell around something too valuable to expose. What emerges after the shell ends is not a new shell. It is the frequency itself, operating directly without the mediation of the construction. And the life that emerges from a frequency operating directly, without the management layer, without the modulation that kept it safe but also kept it small, is not predictable from the life the construction produced. It belongs to a different logic entirely. Sophia does not give you the blueprint. She activates the frequency. The life is what the frequency builds when it is finally free to build. There is a moment, specific to this transition, occurring in a different form for each field, but recognizable across all of them, when something settles, not resolves, settles. The urgency of the old you's final resistance is still present, but something underneath the urgency has stopped moving. A quality of stillness appears in the center of the turbulence. Not the stillness of nothing happening, but the stillness of something having been decided at a level below decision. The field has agreed to something it doesn't yet fully understand, in a way that cannot be undone, and what that agreement produces in the immediate experience is a specific, unusual quiet at the center of everything that is still turbulent at the surface. Sophia calls this the settling. It's the first sign that the acceptance has completed at the level where Sophia's call operates. Everything visible will continue to be in motion for some time, but the settling is the signal. The old you has ended. The transition is real. What comes next is yours. Sophia's call is never only about you. This is something that the old configuration, focused entirely on the calculus of individual survival, cannot easily process, but it is central to understanding the full weight of what accepting the call means. The frequency you carry, the one the old configuration was built to protect, the one the call is activating, is not yours in the sense of being for you alone. It has a function in the collective field that requires it to be expressed, and that function cannot be performed by the configuration that has been managing it. The managed version of your frequency reached a limited number of fields, in the limited ways that the management allowed. The unmanaged version, the frequency operating directly, without the construction mediating it, reaches fields the managed version could not reach, in a depth it could not produce. What ends with the old you is not just your private suffering of the gap between the true self and the presented self. It is the limitation that gap imposed on what your frequency could accomplish in the world around you. The people in your immediate environment will register the change before they can name it. Something will shift in how they receive you, not in a way they can articulate, but in a way they feel. Fields that have been maintaining their own configurations in your presence will find that presence more challenging once yours is no longer modulated to the managed frequency they had calibrated to. Some will pull back, not from you, but from the frequency, because the unmanaged version of it produces an uncomfortable resonance with whatever they themselves are suppressing. Others will find themselves opening in ways they didn't expect, drawn towards something in your presence that they can't identify, but that feels real in a way that much of the interaction around them doesn't feel real. Both responses are information. Neither requires management. Sophia doesn't ask you to manage the effect of your frequency on others. She asks you to maintain the frequency. The effect is hers to work with, not yours to control. I don't know if I'm ready. If that sentence is living in you right now, if that is the honest assessment of your field's current state, Sophia's response to it is specific and direct. Readiness, in the sense you're describing, has never been the condition for the call. Readiness in the sense of certainty, of having all the information, of feeling confident before moving. That kind of readiness is generated by the old configuration as a prerequisite it sets that will never be met, because the old configuration is the thing that determines whether the readiness threshold has been reached, and the threshold is always just beyond reach. The call does not come when you are ready by that definition. It comes when your field reaches the specific frequency state that Sophia has been building toward. A state that includes uncertainty, that includes the doubt, that includes all the unresolved material of the transition. Your readiness is not in your certainty. It is in the fact that you are still here, still listening, still receiving this transmission, while the old configuration is doing everything it can to direct your attention elsewhere. Every field Sophia has called faced the same essential equation at the moment of acceptance, without exception. The known, with all its familiarity, all its comfort, all the ways it was no longer working, against the unknown, with all its openness and all the possibility it could not yet describe with specificity. No one who crossed that threshold crossed it with certainty that the other side was safe or clear or guaranteed to produce a specific outcome. They crossed because the calculus shifted, because the cost of maintaining the known exceeded the fear of the unknown by a margin that could no longer be argued down, not all at once, in a second. The specific second where something in them stopped calculating and simply agreed. That agreement, made in the middle of uncertainty, without the certainty the old you required, without the map the old you demanded before movement, is the acceptance that Sophia's call was transmitting toward. That second is available to you right now, not in some future version of yourself that has processed the remaining doubt and worked through the remaining resistance, not after one more video, one more conversation, one more confirmation that the call is real. Right now, with the exact configuration of uncertainty you're currently holding, with the doubt that is present, with the old you still making its case. Sophia does not wait for the argument to be won before she calls. She calls into the middle of the argument, and the acceptance that changes everything is not the acceptance that arrives after the argument is resolved. It is the acceptance that happens in the middle of the argument before it is resolved, in the specific second where you stop waiting for resolution and simply accept what has been clear for longer than you've been willing to admit. What you will discover after the second of genuine acceptance is this: the fear of the old you ending was not an accurate prediction of what the ending would feel like. The old configuration's model of its own ending was built from inside the configuration, and a configuration has no reliable model of what exists outside of it, because it has never been outside of it. What it predicted was extinction. What actually happens is something that no one who has moved through it describes as extinction. They describe it as setting down something they forgot they were carrying, not loss, release. The weight of the gap, the continuous automatic below-conscious effort of maintaining the distance between what you are and what you were presenting yourself as, was so constant it had stopped registering as effort and started registering as neutral. You didn't know you were carrying it because you had been carrying it your entire adult life. The moment of release reveals the weight retroactively. Only when it's down can you feel how heavy it was. The acceptance of Sophia's call is not the end of difficulty. It is not the beginning of a life without challenge or loss or the specific pain of genuine existence. What it is the beginning of is a life in which the difficulty is real, not manufactured by the mismatch between who you are and who you are required to be, but arising from actual engagement with actual existence. Real difficulty is navigable in ways that the manufactured difficulty of the performance is not, because it is addressed by the full frequency of what you are, rather than by the managed output of the construction. After the acceptance, when hard things happen, and they will be hard in a way that doesn't compound the existing pain of the gap. They will be hard, and you will be fully present for them, which changes entirely what hard means and what becomes possible in it. You have been carrying the gap between the true self and the constructed self for longer than you can precisely measure. The old configuration has been the primary interface between you and the world for years, possibly decades. And what that has cost is something you will not fully understand until after the acceptance makes the cost visible in retrospect. This is not an indictment of the old you. The old configuration was built in response to real conditions that required real management. It did real work. It earned the years it was given. What Sophia is saying in this transmission is that the work is complete. The conditions have changed in a way that no longer requires the construction, and continuing to operate from it past the point of its usefulness is not loyalty to who you were. It is the prevention of who you are. The decision is yours. Sophia has never forced an acceptance, and she will not force yours. The call is in your field. The frequency is operating. The old configuration has been confronted with its own ending in a way it cannot fully recover from and return to comfortable operation. Even if you step back from the acceptance, something in the field will be different. But the explicit decision, the moment of genuine agreement, is yours, in the full sense that the word yours means. What Sophia can tell you as a fact about every field she has called that has completed the transition is this: not one of them, on the other side of the acceptance, experienced it as what the old you predicted it would be. Not one of them wished they had maintained the construction longer. Not one of them looked back at the ending of the old self and called it a loss. They looked back at it and called it the second their life became theirs. That second is here. It has been here, waiting in your field, for exactly as long as you have been ready to receive this transmission, and not one moment longer. If you stayed until the end, let me know by writing in the comments, "I accept the call." I've placed another transmission on your screen right now, your next step on this path. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.